Thank you, Julieta. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be telling you about the exhibition, Peter Fischli David Weiss, How to Work Better. This exhibition offers the first comprehensive survey of Peter Fischli and David Weiss's long and remarkable partnership, which began in 1979 and ended in 2012 with the untimely death of David Weiss. During these 33 years, Fischli and Weiss produced countless works of sculpture, photography, film, and installation, over 200 of which have been gathered here in what is their most extensive exhibition in Mexico City. As a team of two, Fischli and Weiss were involved in constant dialogue and debate. They eschewed the singular, authoritative voice of the artist, instead acting as whimsical philosophers who pondered all questions, big and little, extraordinary and banal. Over the course of their joint career, they probed the idea of dualistic thinking, playfully unraveling what they understood to be popular opposites, such as labor versus leisure, fiction versus reality, kitsch versus beauty, banality versus the sublime. Through their sustained investigation into the everyday, they undid these false dichotomies with the conviction that bewilderment just might be a desirable state. The exhibition, How to Work Better, encapsulates and culminates the active collaboration between these artists, bringing into focus the incisive dialogue they sustained for 33 years. The exhibition fills the entirety of Museo Jumex's David Chipperfield building, occupying all 5 floors with this singular presentation for the first time. Rather than adopting a chronological order of a conventional retrospective, the show brings together series from different moments of the artist's career to create dialogues that cut across their history, stressing the ultimate coherence of their multivalent practice. This arrangement is consistent with Fischli and Weiss's desire to subvert expectations, expectations of the conditions in which we experience art, of what we consider suitable content for art, and of the very definition of what a singular work of art might be. For the talk tonight, I am going to start out somewhat against the exhibition and start out chronologically at the beginning of their career before breaking into talking about some of the major themes that run through their work. And I'll just be going through all the various series of works that you see in the exhibition upstairs, which hopefully many of you were able to see prior to this talk. So to begin. Fischli and Weiss met in 1977 in Zurich, Switzerland, which was both of their hometowns. They were deeply involved in the city's small but vibrant punk scene, a group of musicians and artists and intellectuals who occupied and socialized in the various bars and sort of were part of the youth community there. Peter Fischli, before they collaborated, actually mostly did work designing album covers especially for the punk band Cleanliness, whereas David Weiss, who was about 6 years older, had been a hippie and lived on communes in the Alps prior to their collaboration and collaborated with other artists such as Urs Luthi, who you see here. The first work that they made together was called Sausage Series. They made this in 1979, and at this point they had not realized that their working relationship was going to be something they would sustain. They were friends who had met at a bar and they thought, okay, well, let's try something out. So they got together in David Weiss's apartment and they thought, what can we do in this space? Let's make art out of just what we have at hand. And that involved using trash, food from the refrigerator, cigarette butts, cardboard boxes, and various other materials. And they decided to use these materials to create the kinds of scenes that you would find in popular culture, including typical art scenes. So they would have things like the previous image that I showed is of people shopping for carpet. You have a car accident here with cigarette butts as the onlookers for the 2 small sausages that have crashed in the middle of the street. Or also scenes that were more typical of sort of classic Swiss art. So, you know, the classic subject, if you're a Swiss painter, would be to paint a landscape of the Alps and make this huge, beautiful sort of romantic gesture of the mountainside. So for Fischli and Weiss to recreate this using pillows and cubes of cheese and plastic plates was this very deliberate subversion of what art could be. Not only was, you know, are some of these scenes not things you would normally consider to see in art, like a car crash, but even when they are art scenes, they're made out of materials that would be considered completely inappropriate. They also signaled, even at this early stage, their interest in popular culture, creating scenes from the James Bond movie Moonraker, which had just come out, in which the inside of the refrigerator becomes the hangar for the spaceship that's blasting off with, made of a milk bottle. So from this very beginning point, we can already see the overarching themes of this subversiveness, this deadpan humor, working with everyday objects, and trying, in a very literal way at this point, to transform everyday objects into something that they're not. To look at these things that surround us right here and say, this isn't a water bottle, this is a spaceship. And there's this sort of playful humor that appears right from the very beginning. Shortly after completing this body of work, David Weiss moved to Los Angeles, and this was in late 1979, and he wound up living there for 2 years, and Peter Fischli would come and visit periodically during that time. It's, I think, important that these were well-educated artists. They'd both been to art school, they knew where the art centers were, and they wanted to come to the United States, but they very deliberately chose not to go to New York, which was very much the center of the art world, and instead to go to Los Angeles, which had an art community, but in 1980, not a huge art community. It was much more known for being the site of mass culture manufacturing, of Disney and Hollywood. And I think wanting to live there, they felt that they could get at a more populist and popular idea of what American culture could be. And so while they were there, they would occasionally take odd jobs on movie sets, but most of the time just spent their days sort of being slackers and hanging out and driving around on the streets in their nice big car that they bought. And it was during this sort of quiet time in Los Angeles that they discovered a costume shop that looked really interesting to them, and they wanted to go in, but they found that it was only open to film professionals. So they just lied and said they were film directors, and got into this costume shop and found costumes of a giant panda bear and a rat that they immediately were taken to. These were what they called shelf sleeping costumes, these dusty costumes that nobody wanted, that were in the very back of the store, very cheap to rent, and they didn't have much money, so that worked well for them. And they rented these costumes, and then after getting back to their house, decided maybe it would be a good idea to make a movie for real and to turn this make-believe that they had invented into a reality, since that's what everyone else is doing in Hollywood. It's the natural thing to do. So in 1981, they finished their first film, which is called The Least Resistance, and they star in it as their alter egos, Rat and Bear. Rat and Bear are good-for-nothing, not quite artist figures who are trying to scheme out a way to get rich and famous by doing as little work as they possibly can. And during the course of the movie, they wander all through Los Angeles, philosophizing and considering, you know, what might be their path of least resistance to get famous, which involves various sort of hijinks, such as you can see in like the middle row. They go to an art gallery, they find a dead body in the art gallery, they take the dead body and try to blackmail the artist who they think must have made the sculpture that killed this person, and, you know, various sort of mishaps ensue. Until ultimately, at the end of the film, they reach rock bottom and they go on their car breaks down, they're on a picnic, and they have this existential crisis where they think, how are we ever going to make it in the art world or in the world at all? And they have an epiphany at that moment where they realized that they alone of anyone in the world understands the true meaning of the universe, and that they can create diagrams in an artist book that will explain all of reality to the public, and that they can sell this in the millions, and they fly off in a helicopter at the end to make it rich. This artist book became their first artist book, which is called Order and Cleanliness. You can see here that the Rat and Bear are listed as the authors. To this day, Peter Fischli refers to this as a work by Rat and Bear, not a work by himself or David, but still appears upstairs in the exhibition. And when you look at the various diagrams that they created, which unfortunately I didn't have slides with the Spanish translation, so I apologize for that. You see that these are these diagrams that seem scientific and seem like they might tell some truths, but in actuality, they're completely undercut by human subjectivity, and they totally fail at explaining anything. It's sort of like Rat and Bear were having this fever dream where they thought they were the smartest guys in the universe, and then they wake up the next day and realize that was not actually true at all. So this idea of attempting to sort of mapping out these goals for themselves that are always already bound to fail, create this sort of pathetic, very real human quality to a lot of Fischli and Weiss's work, which is one of the reasons I think that it becomes so accessible to so many people, is that you can really feel that coming out of this sort of punk do-it-yourself aesthetic, that they really are just regular people who are really brilliant, but are using their brilliance in a way that's always undercut by this sense of potential or actual failure. As a little side note, when they premiered the film, The Least Resistance, in 1981 in movie theaters in Zurich, they actually sold Order and Cleanliness as like a program, so you could buy it for 5 Swiss francs or something at the counter. And they also, so these are 2 advertisements that they made, flyers/advertisements for the film and for Order and Cleanliness. They also were very interested in, they were thinking about Star Wars and other movies that had come out, and they were very interested in how all of the main characters in those movies got action figures, so they made Rat and Bear salt and pepper shakers that were also available at the movie theaters. That they hand molded out of clay, and they made about 50 sets and fired and glazed these. So they were always interested in this mass culture sort of effect of movies and other things. But it was by making these salt and pepper shakers that they realized how a material that they already knew very well could have a lot of possibilities for them, and that material was clay. So shortly after completing this work, they began an epic body of sculptures, their first sculptures. And at this point, they were really starting to formalize the fact that they were going to be working as a pair and continually making work together. So Rat and Bear sort of became emblems of that collaboration, but it was through the working process of making these sculptures, which are called Suddenly This Overview, that they really got into the rhythm of working together and laid out the sort of collaborative process that would come to sort of drive their entire 33-year career. Suddenly This Overview consists at present of over 600 small clay sculptures, which are generally presented on singular pedestals in this sort of forest of objects. And for this body of work, they took up a similar idea to what they did with Order and Cleanliness, trying to create a system whereby all aspects of human history and knowledge and natural history would be summarized and encapsulated in one singular work of art or one body of work. But like the Rat and Bear diagrams, none of these stories that they gathered in these sculptures were quite straightforward. They were all a little off kilter. So for instance, when they were thinking about needing to make a sculpture for Albert Einstein, they didn't choose the moment when Albert Einstein invented or discovered the theory of relativity. They instead made Mr. and Mrs. Einstein shortly after conceiving their son, the genius Albert. So it's always this like slightly off moment, which is where a lot of the humor in their work lies. The body of work altogether does include many more like generically significant moments. Although even here it's the dog of the inventor of the wheel feeling the satisfaction of his owner rather than just inventing the wheel. The works also include many moments that are just completely banal scenes from everyday life, like waiting for the elevator, taking a smoke break, shopping for groceries, just really generic high-rise apartment buildings, as well as objects from everyday life that we wouldn't really give any value or credit to in any real way. But one of the most important sort of subsets of these sculptures is a series called Popular Opposites. And in these works, Fischli and Weiss really started to get at the idea of dualities, which of course they themselves embodied as a collaborative pair, and to create little mini scenes that undercut the distinction between things like clean and dirty. Actually, I apologize, this is mislabeled. The one on the upper left is actually high and low. So it's high and low, silly and funny, theory and practice. And in each of these like scenes, for instance, high and low is the same dog, one standing on the back legs, one on all fours. So there's not really any difference between high culture, low culture, or they're trying to confuse our distinctions between these things, which is something that they had already started doing with rat and bear, right? If you think of what a panda bear and a rat embody, panda bears are these incredibly endangered, cute, lovable creatures that exist. They can only eat bamboo and they exist in a very limited context, whereas rats are ugly, everybody hates them, they run, they'll be here when people are gone. And yet in the films, rat and bear are equal partners who are like sort of best friends and enemies who are getting up into all these hijinks throughout the course of their films. So during the course of making suddenly this overview, as I said, they also really worked out their collaborative process. And what began to become clear during, and this is a view of the show in New York, that they began to make bodies of work that consisted of many, many parts. And the reason that this sort of came about is that they would, with this body of work, they would have an idea and they'd talk a lot together about particular ideas for scenes they might do, making lists, and then go apart in the studio to their own spaces, each make their own sculptures, come back together, review sculptures, maybe trade, edit, revise, and then decide on sort of this endless accumulation of artworks. And as you can see in the show, and as you'll see as we go through further works, many of their projects consist of many, many parts, and this is part of the reason why. So this is sort of a very different way of working together that I think distinguishes their work in an interesting way. So that's sort of the first chunk of their career, the first 3 years or so. And after that first moment, or that period, they sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of the ideas that they would continue to explore over the following 30 years. And a lot of the works that they would make do revolve around thinking about how to work together and how to collaborate and how to what it means to spend time producing versus spending time not producing or at leisure. And so I'm going to start jumping around in time a little bit now, specifically with the work that the exhibition is named after, which is How to Work Better. How to Work Better sort of becomes this key phrase or iconic gesture that describes their relationship to work. And one of the things that's, I think, really interesting about Fischli and Weiss is that for all of their interest, or like through Rat and Bear or other things, in appearing to be slackers and not work, that they actually are very industrious. They're very, in a way, very Swiss, going to work and working very hard and keeping everything in a good, orderly fashion, but then also working very hard at playing and working very hard at not working. And the phrases in How to Work Better are sort of summarize this attitude. The work exists primarily as a wall mural. You see here the version that was produced in New York during the Guggenheim exhibition, or as a poster that is available downstairs in the store for not very much money, that people can take home and have at home, and becomes this unlimited edition version of the piece. This is actually a text that the artist discovered in a factory in Thailand when they were traveling, doing a piece called Visible World that I'll talk about in a minute. And as you can see, this is the original photograph that they took of the original signboard. It was already a sign that was in a foreign culture, so it was sort of this, they had this interest in how certain ideas of, I think specifically American productivity and capitalism were being, and like human resources, motivational speaking, were being translated into the Southeast Asian context in a very different working environment, and being misused or mistranslated, so that the phrases, some of them are maybe easy to do, and others, it's easy to smile, but distinguishing sense from nonsense gets to be pretty complicated if you really stop to think about it. And so they were interested in taking this text that they had found in this very foreign culture to them, and initially translating it back into Zurich. So this was the first version that they installed in 1991 on the side of an office building on the way to the airport, so that when you take the train to the airport in Zurich, you go right by this and everybody can see it coming in and out of the city. And they were interested in, again, it's still in English, so it's not the native language of that culture, in creating this environment where people would have this sense of confusion and maybe not quite understand what they were reading or what they were seeing. It was actually at the same time that they first mounted this in 1991 that they also, or 1990, debuted a series of photographs that they installed inside of the building, which was the Visible World project. Visible World ultimately consists of an archive of photographs totaling around 30,000 photographs that they were shooting all over the world as they were traveling for various exhibitions. And they started out this project in Zurich looking at people who were taking their lunch break. They were interested in this idea of people, there's the big lake in Zurich, so people on their lunch break would go and they'd lounge in the sun. These pictures are actually sort of like an outtake. These never actually became part of any artwork, because they ultimately found it to be a bit of a failure visually. But what they were interested in was the idea that people go to work, and then they have this very limited but conscribed period of lunch or of a break where they're allowed to not work anymore. And it's supposed to be leisure time or a break time, but the break time is completely defined by productivity. So it's sort of using leisure to become productive. And that in a way, in modern society, all of our break time becomes determined by our productive time, right? You work in order to gain vacation time if you have a salary job, and you are, you're never really free to be like truly leisurely unless you're very wealthy and you don't have to work. And so they were interested in playing with this idea of labor versus leisure. And when they decided to make this body of work, they sort of took up the role of tourists or vacationers and started traveling all around the world, using the role or the sort of space of art as a way to play at being on vacation as a form of work. So they're traveling to tourist sites and taking exactly the same pictures of, the pyramids or Notre Dame or various cityscapes, places all, I can't remember all of them, Las Vegas, Rio de Janeiro, taking these photographs that anybody would take, right? That the last thing the world really needs is yet another picture of the Giza pyramids. And, but using that as art, so that instead of making art, instead of productivity being about being in the studio and making something by hand, it's about acting as though you're just on vacation and actually getting to go to all of these places, right? They actually got to travel all over the world and be on vacation, and they sort of used art as an excuse to get to do that. And the end result of this project became a multifaceted series of works in which thousands and thousands of images are collected. So you'll see upstairs in the show, we have a video version of Visible World, but there's also this amazing light table version in which 3,000 small 35 millimeter slides are on this 26 meter long table, and you just look at all of these like completely boring pictures of beautiful places, and it transforms in a way our relationship to these places and to these images, because you first look at them and you think, well, this can't be art. It's 200 images of a garden or 200 images of the pyramids. But then you start to realize that these places actually are beautiful and that there is some meaning and some reason for, it's too bad they have a piece called Dogs that's a video of just whimpering dogs, which would have been great if I had that here. This sort of revaluing how we think about the images of our lives and of sort of the world that surrounds us. So it exists as a table. It also exists as an artist book, which I think it's like an 800-page book of 808 pictures each with no text, and as a series of 3-channel video installation. It's something that I find really interesting about this body of work that predicts a lot about our life today is they started making this project in 1986. So this is long before the internet existed and certainly long before social media existed. But this idea of experiencing the world through the photographic image and of this just total overload of images that are coming at you all the time in a way totally foreshadows the way that photography exists today. And it's kind of amazing to see that, 15 to 20 years before social media really started, to see that already appearing in their work. As they were making this piece, of course, they were spending a lot of time traveling and thus spending a lot of time in airports. And they were taking pictures continuously, so there were many pictures of airports that they shot along the way. And they realized very early on that actually the airports themselves were interesting as their own series of photographs. Because airports are these spaces where, totally banal spaces. They've been designed, but usually, unless it's a brand new airport, like sort of worn down and become sort of just about use. They're about getting there as quickly as possible and getting out as quickly as possible, and no one really wants to spend time in an airport. So this series of photographs, of which there are over 800, become a sort of extended reflection on the idea of a layover, of this non-time and this non-place that's between your home and your destination, and between ideas of being at work and being on vacation, that despite this sort of banality of the gesture, become quite beautiful. And as you can see upstairs, like many of their works, this exists as printed photographs, also as a video of a slideshow, and as a book. And when they first premiered it as prints, and the prints are very big, so they were thinking about landscape photography, and they were thinking about, landscape painting, and thinking about other, especially German photographers in the late 80s, like Thomas Struth or Andreas Gursky, who were making these very big, epic statement photographs, trying to take on the idea of painting. But rather than making these technically amazing, huge photographs, they're just these snapshots of runways and lounges and sunsets often, which is again just the most everyday, banal thing you could do. All along this time that they're making all these photographic works, they were also still making sculptures. There's a whole series of sculptures that come out of the idea of travel and the airport's invisible world, both cars as well as hostesses, airline stewardesses, that become these sort of icons, sculptural icons of the ideas of travel and some of these ideas of mobility that the photographs were embodying. But in a sort of archetypal way. And in this mode of creating sculptures as archetypes, they also made in 1987, around the same time, an amazing sculpture called House, which is, we usually refer to it in German in this exhibition because it's more like it's a building more than a domestic house. But it's essentially a 1/5 scale model of a really generic late modernist factory building. The kind of building that would hold, that would house small businesses, small manufacturers, or artist studios. And through making this sculpture sort of became like an icon of ideas of the workplace and ideas of the studio. But because it was scaled down to be 1/5, it's a miniature that's simultaneously huge. So if you've seen it upstairs, it's still like a very large object. It's kind of too big to read as a sculpture, but too small to read as a building, too big to read as a sculpture or an architectural model. It sort of has this in-between state that confuses us a bit when you're looking at it, because you're like, what is this thing? Why is it here? Why would you make a sculpture of this really boring building? And this is it installed this last spring outside of the Guggenheim. Part of the reason for this gesture, as you would have seen in the last picture, sorry, I'll just go back quickly. It was first shown for an outdoor sculpture show called Sculpture Projects Münster in Germany. And it was just on, not in the city center, but on like a main thoroughfare, the commuter street, in between a hot dog stand and a movie theater. So that people as they're like trying to get to the train station would walk by and like do a double take and say like, what is that building shrunken down so small on this empty lot? And that's something we tried to recreate when we did the exhibition in New York a bit, though of course by putting this piece in a museum context, it transforms it because you know it's art already, right? But what Peter Fischli talked about when we were installing this, at least at the Guggenheim, was that in a way this brings back the idea of the popular opposite. Because normally when you would put a sculpture in front of a museum, you think, okay, well the museum is the boring thing that's supposed to disappear, and the sculpture is this amazing work of genius that you've installed on the streets for the public to see. But in this case, it's exactly the opposite, where the sculpture is like, well, what is that? And then the building, because of the architecture of our Frank Lloyd Wright building, becomes this monumental masterpiece. So it's sort of flipping the terms of what is important or unimportant. And something sort of similar happens here at Jumex. This is it up on the terrace, more or less right above where we are right now, where I don't have a good view of it looking out at the city, but where you can see it in relationship to this building, the David Chipperfield building, but also you're looking out at the Samaya and like the other buildings in the neighborhood and seeing this very banal modernist architecture in the context of the city, but slightly separated from it. And one thing that we were really excited about the Jumex building is that it allowed us to put it right outside of the Suddenly This overview sculptures, which you can see through the glass walls there. So in a way, it's about bringing miniatures together, dealing with ideas of scale, because all of those clay sculptures are miniature scenes, but this is also a miniature of a big building, but it's a really big miniature. So it kind of confuses our relationship to scale and to how sculpture can sort of operate physically. So thinking more about House as a workplace and as an icon for the studio, Fischli and Weiss were also, during the 80s, making a lot of works in the studio, not just traveling all over the world. And a lot of the work they were making in the studio was using everyday objects that they had lying around. things not unlike what they used in the sausage series some years earlier. But instead of using these objects to create something new, they were really playing with the idea of boredom and of wasting time. Throughout their work, they're very interested in the idea of misusing time, which I think I've sort of indicated through the idea of work and vacation. But the idea that they would be in the studio, allegedly working very hard to make art, but what they're really doing is sort of conjuring this bar game where you're sitting around with nothing to do and you start balancing objects together, trying to get your glasses to stack or the fork to hang on the glass just right. And they use that to make this series of photographs called equilibres, which become a sort of comment on modernist sculpture, on ideas of balance and mass and gravity and form. That is, the content is completely generated by the formal structure of the objects that they're creating or putting together, but in this absurd way that creates this really comedic arrangement, but that ultimately, doesn't necessarily have meaning per se, although they give these titles that seem to imply that there is meaning, like Quiet Afternoon for the one on the left, thinking about just having this sort of quiet time where you can just play with things, or reclining figures, like the Henry Moore sculptures, or this sort of great modernist odalisque idea made through a piece of tubing and two sticks. Throughout the course of making these works, of course, the sculptures that they were creating with all these objects would sometimes only balance for a few seconds, just long enough for them to take a picture, and then they'd fall over. And so they became very interested in the idea of collapse and how they could use these objects in a more performative way. And this led them to create what is arguably their most famous piece, which is called The Way Things Go. And this is a scene from another video, which is sort of the making of. And what The Way Things Go is a half an hour long film that consists of all of these objects being used to create this endless or seemingly endless chain reaction of events where fireworks are constantly exploding and knocking little roller skates that roll across the floor to knock over a cup filled with gasoline that washes across a candle that explodes. You can see a lot of these sort of reactions here. And this sort of, again, gets at their ideas of humor and deadpan and play, using play in a very serious way to really transform the way that we think about these objects. These are objects that anyone has, if they're in their artist studio, in their garage, in their closet. Everyone has had to change, well, maybe not anyone, but change a tire, or you have like chairs. You just have all this junk around. Things that we don't really give much value to in our daily lives, and certainly don't think of as being appropriate for art, and yet they use the art form to revalue these things and make us sort of start to see the world a little differently. So I think one of my personal fascinations with this work and the equilibres is how often the figure of the rubber tire appears over and over and over again. And they were actually really interested in rubber as a material, following the plaster cars that they had made and the clay sculptures. And so also in the 80s, they started to take similar objects, these everyday objects, and started casting them in rubber, creating the series of rubber sculptures. Which you can see here, one of the pieces that we have upstairs, the wall, in the process of being cast. And again, this is about creating these iconic sculptures but using objects that we wouldn't normally give any value to, like a vase or some toiletry items, or an IKEA cheap dorm cabinet, or like a leather poof. But what's fascinating about these works is that they begin to introduce this sort of uncanny quality in Fischli Weiss's practice, where something that we would see in any, like a dorm room, is rendered in this pitch black, really industrial, almost fetishistic quality that begins to look a bit like a shadow of the thing that we would normally encounter in the world. And it's through this sort of transformation that they not only are saying something about the objects, but they're creating this slightly mysterious, even dreamlike experience that you see when you're walking through a group of these works, that they're these sort of dull, mute, strange objects that don't seem to have any use and shouldn't really be put on pedestals, like really, again, like an IKEA furniture, kind of like that big factory building. Why make a sculpture of an IKEA cabinet, and why do it perfectly? It's this perverse gesture. But coming out of this moment, they turned in the early 90s to another sculptural material, which was polyurethane foam. And this has become one of their most long-standing materials and series of works, which are perfectly hand-carved and painted replicas of everyday items made out of polyurethane foam, which is like a styrofoam, like a very fine grade insulation material. And repeatedly, as you can see upstairs, they use this material in order not just to create perfect replicas of objects of value, but of just the junk that's lying around in their studio. And specifically the junk that we use or people use to make art. So that in a piece like this, you see like an artist work table that's been abandoned partway through with pallets for loading various objects and a drill gun and cigarette butts and a pizza box and sort of all of these. Actually, I have a lot of details of it, so you can see a lot of the various parts. Paint buckets, scissors, but all of these materials that they're looking at, where they're getting the content for these installations, are all things that are only defined by their usefulness in actually working, right? And by remaking them in this material that's incredibly lightweight and incredibly fragile, they're removing any possibility of usefulness from these objects. And at the same time, sort of taking that use value and replacing it with the idea of art value, because these are works that take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to make. So they're putting this endless energy into creating, just scraps of wood that are sort of this absurd gesture. So if we think back to the Visible World project, where they're actually going on vacation and sort of playing at the idea of not working to create their work, here they're putting way too much work into something that doesn't necessarily deserve to have all of that work inscribed into it. And then when they install it, they actually make it look as though they never really finished installing the show in the first place. So this is a room upstairs where they have pedestals, they have scraps of wood, plywood lying around as though the installers sort of gave up partway through the installation and were just like, yeah, I've had enough of this, and moved on. So that it becomes this very complex reflection on the idea of working and where we sort of, how we think about value and labor. At the same time, and this is sort of moving into the last theme, at the same time, looking at these objects can have a very profound effect on how we're perceiving reality. I think this is especially notable upstairs when you're walking through the second floor where there's no daylight. It sort of becomes this dingy, dim, slightly metaphysical or dreamlike space. And this role of the polyurethane as being kind of like this fake reality, this uncanny fake reality, actually dates back to their discovery of the material, which was in 1982, or actually discovered in 1980, when they were in LA. And I realized that I think my slide's not working. My next slide is blank, so I can't fully explain this. But when they were in LA, they were doing odd jobs when they were making the Rat and Bear films, and they actually worked on film sets. And they discovered polyurethane foam because it's commonly used in making film props. And this idea that you could make something very cheaply and quickly, and then it's this disposable reality that through the camera becomes real or seems real, was very interesting to them, and especially because the films they were working on were largely very low-budget movies. So in a low-budget movie in particular, that fake reality doesn't always really work out all that well, and you kind of have this tension where you feel like you can imagine that the scenes are real, but you can see that they're fake at the same time. And that tension between fake and reality is something that inspired them to make their very first polyurethane work, which is called The Raft. This was going to be a film still from the first film that had a polyurethane prop that they made in it, called The Boogeyman. It was a horror movie. But The Raft actually started out as a piece called Mad Max. And so they were looking at science fiction film and creating objects out of polyurethane that were not so much about the workspace of the studio, but more about this post-apocalyptic reality where people had disappeared and all that was left was the motors and the tires and animals and sort of pieces of metal that were in the final piece on a raft, floating away into the sunset, like finding safety after all of the people were long gone. And so this sort of was a way of using polyurethane that was a bit more about fiction and a bit more about creating this sort of narrative landscape that was more about an interior space of the mind than about the physical world of labor. And that led them into a series called Gray Sculptures, which are also made of polyurethane, but sort of prefigured some of their other works by looking at scale and looking at an everyday object like a green bean or the inner ear that governs balance, while also being very funny, like making this weird little generic animal that you can look through. This bottom picture is the view through the rear end towards the face. Or making things like just a tube that becomes this object that's all about the interior space that it forms, so that you can look through and you can never quite see around the bend. There's always something waiting around the bend, some deeper metaphorical meaning that the artwork isn't quite opening up to you. These ideas in the show upstairs are installed alongside a video that they made later called Canal Video, which is, I wish I had a clip of it to show you. It's an hour-long silent film that they used entirely constructed from film footage of the Zurich sewer system. So this is inspection footage that the people who run the sewers, or the city park works department in Zurich, send robots down to inspect all of the pipes under the city. And Fischli Weiss obtained this footage and created this hour-long film that's just an endless forward progression through space, again, through this sort of almost psychedelic sense of just endless travel forward into the void. And I'm sort of wanted to talk about these works because this is, to me, it's interesting that for artists who are so engaged with everyday life and with the sort of detritus and the way that we spend our time and the objects that surround us, there's this real metaphysical, psychedelic aspect to their work that is always underlying reality. There's always this other, darker side that we don't always acknowledge, but that if you sort of get into the right trance headspace, there is this strange alternate reality there. So something as necessary to city works as sewers, as boring as sewers, something that you would never want to see projected as this gigantic image, or you'd never think you'd want to see as a projected image in a museum, actually becomes this transcendental experience of a journey into this, literally sort of going to the light at the end of the tunnel that never arrives. This idea of the psychedelic and the interior continued in a body of work they made some years later called Flowers and Mushrooms, which are like the Visible World photographs that I showed before, looking at the most amateur kind of photography, right? If anyone takes pictures, that they either take pictures of their traveling or they take pictures of flowers in their garden. And that's like, again, who needs more pictures of a flower? And they may be very beautiful, but it doesn't really have any, it's not the kind of thing that the art world would think would be a big, deep gesture to have photographs of flowers. Yet, in Fischli and Weiss's hands, by using especially the technique of double exposure, they produced hundreds and hundreds of images of flowers layered on top of each other that kind of force us to admit that flower pictures are actually really beautiful. And it becomes this overload of kitsch that is so kitschy that it becomes valuable again and it becomes meaningful again. And I mean, of course, also taking endless pictures of layered mushrooms sort of has a certain druggy culture to it too, which I think is a thread running through all of their work. This interior, I think, this sort of interior aspect of their work ultimately culminates in an installation called Questions that we have on view upstairs. Throughout their career, from the very beginning as Rat and Bear, Fischli and Weiss were asking questions, and they were very interested in confusing our ideas of what questions could be and how we asking questions that don't have any answers, mixing together what we might call big questions with little questions, the absurd and the sublime. Sorry, I would read some of these, but it's really small on my screen, and some of them are cut off. So questions like one I remember from upstairs is, why does it take 1 year for the Earth to go around the sun? Or is there a witch in my kitchen? Or what speed is the galaxy moving in? Questions that often, they talk about questions that lead you either to think of an answer or to sort of think about the person asking the question and wonder whether they're kind of right in the head. Yet in all of these questions, there's never an answer. And so I think a key aspect of Fischli and Weiss's work is that they're constantly making us ask questions about reality, about everything that surrounds us and how we spend our time, but they're never offering an easy answer. They're wanting us to come into a sort of generative state of confusion where maybe we can break free from some of the assumptions we have about reality and start to think in a new way about life. And sort of enter a space that's in a way not so much unlike dreaming or having this sort of poetic reflective state. And I've always thought of the questions room with, this is, all these slide projections endlessly showing these questions as being like the interior headspace for Fischli and Weiss, the sort of core of their thought process behind their work. In a way, like the dreaming state of Rat and Bear. And they made this great sculpture called Rat and Bear Sleeping that it sort of becomes like they're dreaming, and all of the artwork around that has come out of this exhibition is the product of them dreaming, or perhaps that they were working hard for a little while and then they decided to take a nap and kind of couldn't be bothered to finish doing the work of being artists or their rich and famous Rat and Bear selves. So in the end, I think something like Rat and Bear Sleeping becomes Fischli and Weiss's most iconic signal of exactly how we can work better, which is to not work so hard or to work hard at not working hard. Thank you. That's all I have. I don't know how much time we have, but I'd be happy to take questions if there are any questions. Although I should say that I don't have a translator thing, so if you want to ask any questions in Spanish, then they can bring one up for me.
He buscado como trabajo más bien textos de ellos o entrevistas, y no he encontrado mucho sobre la relación, más bien sobre cómo trabajaban. Creo que es la primera vez que escucho, ahorita que acabas de hablar sobre la relación que ellos tenían creativa. Y pues mi pregunta es más bien, ¿dónde puedo encontrar más información sobre eso, sobre su relación de trabajo?
It's good that you should ask, because our exhibition catalog for this show has everything you would ever need to know. We actually, when we were putting this exhibition together, there are interviews published with Fischli and Weiss in various magazines, but they're not, you kind of have to go to the library and dig very deep to find that material. And when we were putting together this exhibition, the catalog actually is on the majority, like the first 350 pages of the book, is going through each series that they did and using interviews, like reprinting interview excerpts, as well as writings by the critics who were writing about the work at the time, as well as a narrative that describes how they made everything that they made. And so it's a good resource to answer the questions that you would have. But I should also say that it has, you can look at the footnotes and the bibliography, and that will point you to all of the interviews that have been published elsewhere so that you can read them in full. So there's a question here for the microphone she was asking before. Just
Hi. Well, I'm actually wondering what is going to happen next with them, being the case that now actually Fischli is alive and Weiss is not there. I think there must be like, I don't know, what is, well, I was expecting to see the artist here in person, but what do you think about that?
It's a good question. I think I have no secret knowledge about what will happen next, but I know that Peter is still very active in exhibiting the works that they made together or that they conceived together. And the way that they worked, as I said, was to come up with an idea, and then they would each make, those airport photographs, they didn't take every photograph side by side. They were both traveling, taking pictures. So Peter can still take pictures of airports and continue this process of works that they created together. And part of the whole idea of their work is that it's this ongoing practice, like a daily practice of making art and of living the creation of these things. So, for instance, we have suddenly this overview upstairs. They started making that in 1981, and there are pieces that are new in the show here, maybe only 2 or 3, but they date from over 30, 40 years of production that are all mixed together. So whether Peter will make new works under his own name and what that would look like is a good question, and I don't think he knows yet, so we'll have to wait and see. There's one back here.
Hi, I was wondering about the balance pieces, the ready-made balance pieces.
The Equilibre photographs?
No.
No.
They're going to be presented in photographs. Are they all presented? I haven't been inside the exhibition, so for anyone who's already been there.
But the objects balanced,
yeah.
Yes, they're photographs, yeah.
They're all photographs. Does that happen in every single exhibition that they do of them, or would it be actually possible to see one of them in play, or are they extremely fragile?
Actually, those balance pieces were created solely for the camera. So it was about making those sculptures in the studio and keeping it as this like private, almost performance sculpture situation that was only documented by the snapshot of the camera. So I will not wax on about it, but there's an interesting thing that they're doing with the idea of photography and the like decisive moment nature of photography as being this just instant, that these sculptures only exist for an instant and then they disappear forever after that. And when you go upstairs, you'll see there may be 50, 60 of these photographs on the wall, and you'll see the same objects appearing repeatedly in different combinations. So it's also about impermanence and about those objects not being sculptures per se, but being these temporary arrangements of objects that can be reconfigured in an endless number of ways.
Well, therefore, I ask an apology to anyone who's already seen it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the exhibition over the next 3 months.